Billionaire saw a maid snapped it for helping his autistic daughter. He walked up and said, "You're hired." The lobby of the Celestine Grand shimmered with glass and gold. Guests moved like flowing water. Businessmen in suits, tourists dragging suitcases, staff gliding silently in press uniforms. But in the middle of that perfect order, a small tremor began. A little girl stood near the grand fountain, her tiny hands pressed to her ears. Her breathing was fast, too fast. The chandelier lights above shimmered and flickered, reflections bouncing in the water, too bright, too loud, too much. Her name was Emma Rivers, 7 years old, bright, sensitive, autistic, and the only daughter of Adrian Rivers, billionaire real estate mogul known for his impossible standards and quieter temper. He was across the lobby on a business call when he heard it, the sound of his daughter's soft whimper turning into a sharp cry. "Emma?" His voice broke through the noise, calm but tight. He moved toward her, but the crowd thickened, check-ins, suitcases rolling, phones buzzing. The sounds grew harsher, sharper. Emma dropped to the floor beside the fountain, covering her face. People stared. Some whispered. Most moved away. And then someone moved toward her. Grace Miller was just another face in a gray uniform, the hotel's youngest housekeeping attendant, a soft-spoken woman who moved like she was always apologizing for existing. But when she saw the child trembling, her instincts overruled everything else. She knelt down slowly, a few feet away, not touching, not crowding. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe. You're safe, sweetheart." She placed one hand over her own heart, then opened it slowly, a gesture, not a command. Emma's breathing hitched. Her wide eyes flickered toward Grace's hand. Grace smiled gently and began to breathe in rhythm, slow, deep, in out and out. A security guard started forward. "Miss, you can't." Adrian raised a hand to silence him. For once, he didn't care about the rules. He just watched. Emma's shoulders began to settle. Her fingers stopped fluttering. She looked at Grace again, this time without fear. Grace smiled, still calm. "You're doing amazing." It was like watching a storm ease into sunlight. The air softened. The noise faded. Emma blinked, then reached out, a small hand brushing Grace's sleeve. Adrian exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He walked toward them slowly. His polished shoes clicked against the marble, each step deliberate, careful. Grace looked up quickly, startled. "I'm sorry, sir, I just—" Before she could finish, a sharp voice cut across the air. "Grace." It was her supervisor, Mrs. Harlow, stiff and red-faced, striding from behind the reception desk. "What do you think you're doing? You left your assigned floor." Grace flinched. She was... "You're not here to babysit guest children," the woman snapped. "Do your job, not theirs." The silence that followed was brutal. Emma pressed closer to Grace's leg, sensing the anger even if she couldn't understand the words. Grace looked down at the child, then up at her furious boss. Her voice trembled, but her spine straightened. "If helping a scared child is against the rules, then maybe I don't belong here." She unclipped her badge, the one she'd polished every morning, and set it gently on the counter. Then she turned, took Emma's hand for one small squeeze, and walked away. The crowd parted as she left, quiet now. Adrian stood frozen, torn between the daughter clinging to his leg and the woman walking away with quiet dignity. He looked down at Emma, then after Grace, then made his choice. He followed. Adrian caught up with Grace just outside the lobby doors, the late afternoon sun cutting across the hotel steps. She paused, hands clutching her cleaning cart, breathing uneven but her face steady. She started, but Adrian raised a hand gently. "You don't need to explain," he said, voice calm, but heavy with something unspoken. "I saw everything." Grace blinked, unsure. Her chest tightened. "Sir, I shouldn't have." "You shouldn't have helped her?" Adrian asked, stepping closer, his gaze fixed on the little girl clinging to the edge of his coat. "Or you shouldn't have followed your heart when everyone else told you not to?" Grace swallowed hard. The words hovered between them, heavy with judgment and relief. She had been told all her life that following rules meant survival. And yet, the moment Emma reached for her hand, all the fear and doubt dissolved. Adrian's eyes softened. He knelt slightly so his height didn't intimidate her. "You don't work for them anymore," he said. His voice carried weight, not anger, not command, but certainty. "You work for me now." Grace froze. Her hand instinctively reached to Emma again, who looked at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Me? Work for you?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Adrian nodded. "Yes, if you'll accept." She blinked, trying to process. Wealth and power were concepts she'd never chased. Titles meant little, but this was about something entirely different. Respect, integrity, and above all, safety for the child she had chosen to protect. Her voice came out trembling, but sure. I accept." Adrian smiled faintly, a rare warmth touching his usually reserved features. "Good. Then we start tomorrow." Grace exhaled slowly, the tension draining from her shoulders. The weight of rules and reprimands melted, replaced by something she hadn't expected. Recognition for doing what was right. Emma squeezed Grace's hand, her small gesture louder than any words. Grace knelt beside her, letting the child lean against her shoulder. Adrian watched, standing a few steps back, seeing something money could never buy. Trust. Mrs. Harlow's angry words echoed faintly behind the glass doors. Rules, procedures, chains. But outside in the sun, the girl was safe, and Grace had made a choice she would never regret. Adrian's voice broke the silence, quiet but firm. "Integrity is rare. You showed it today. Never doubt that what's right matters more than what's convenient." Grace looked up at him, eyes wide. "Thank you, sir." He shook his head gently. "Not thank me. Thank yourself. You followed your heart when it mattered most." And for the first time that day, the world outside the lobby seemed to pause. Chaos still swirled inside, but here, just beyond those doors, someone had chosen courage over obedience, love over fear. And Adrian knew Emma had just found a protector she could trust. Grace smiled softly, Emma still holding her hand. And Adrian, silent, watched, realizing that sometimes the right choice didn't need permission, only bravery. Adrian Rivers had built empires, yes. Towers that scraped the clouds, investments that spanned continents, a name that commanded attention in boardrooms. But behind all that steel and glass, he had built another kind of structure, one far harder to see. He had built walls. Around his heart, around his life, around Emma. It hadn't been intentional, not exactly. After his wife died giving birth to Emma, grief had swallowed him whole. He had retreated into work, into control, into schedules and contracts that could be signed and managed, because those things obeyed him. People did not. People disappointed. People left. Emma, with her sharp senses and delicate rhythms, had taught him that the world could be loud, unpredictable, even cruel. And he had recoiled. Every meltdown, every sudden cry, every panicked glance from her, he had tried to fix it with logic, with routines, with schedules, with money. Anything but letting himself feel. Standing on the hotel steps, watching Grace kneel beside his daughter, Adrian felt the walls he'd built shiver. A brick loosened, another cracked. He remembered the night spent alone in his office, staring at spreadsheets and balance sheets, wishing he could buy back the moments he had lost with Emma. He remembered the therapists, the programs, the experts, all of them competent, all of them licensed, all of them utterly unable to reach her. And now, here was Grace, quiet, small, unassuming, doing what none of them could. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He glanced down at Emma, her small hand curled around Grace's fingers, her breathing slowing, the tremor in her shoulders fading. Adrian realized that his walls had kept out more than just strangers. They had kept out love, connection, trust. Grace had not followed protocol. She had ignored the rules. She had done exactly what his careful, control world told her not to do. And yet, somehow, she had broken through the barriers he had failed to tear down himself. Adrian straightened, taking a deep breath. He had always been a man of action, a man who solved problems efficiently, decisively. And now he faced a new problem. Himself. How do you lead someone who cannot be led by authority, who will only respond to understanding, patience, and heart? He knew the answer without thinking. You step aside. You let them guide you. You trust. Adrian's eyes softened as he looked at Grace. She was trembling slightly now, holding herself upright, holding Emma's trust with gentle care. You're remarkable, he said, voice low, almost lost the breeze. Grace looked up, startled. Sir, you heard me, he replied. You've done what I've been trying to do for years and failed. You've shown her safety, patience, love, and understanding. For the first time in a long time, Adrian Rivers felt that the walls he had built were not just fragile. They could crumble. And maybe, with someone like Grace, they didn't need to be rebuilt. He turned his gaze to Emma, still nestled close to Grace, and felt a warmth spread through him that no skyscraper, no contract, no fortune could ever provide. This was the kind of foundation worth building. And for the first time, Adrian realized that some walls weren't meant to protect you from the world. They were meant to be taken down, brick by brick, by someone brave enough to reach in and stay. Grace Miller had been working at the Celestine Grand for almost 3 years. In that time, she had polished floors until they gleamed, scrubbed bathrooms until they smelled of lavender, and arranged flowers so that each guest felt welcome. She moved through the hotel quietly, a shadow who went unnoticed unless something went wrong. And even then, she rarely spoke up. It wasn't that she was timid. It was choice. Grace had learned early that the world rewarded compliance, not courage. Complaints were seen as weakness, questions as irritation. And yet, inside her, a small fire burned, one that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many times she was told, stay in your lane. She had grown up in a small town, where responsibility fell heavy on young shoulders. Her parents had worked long hours, leaving Grace to care for her younger brother after school. He had ADHD, bright and brilliant but chaotic. Grace had learned patience, creativity, and silence, tools that no school ever taught. She had become a quiet anchor for someone who needed stability, someone who needed someone to notice without words. That instinct followed her into the Celestine Grand. She noticed things others overlooked, a guest trembling while checking in, a child hiding behind a parent's leg, a coworker struggling under an impossible workload. And she acted, always quietly, always without expectation. It was why, when she saw Emma on the lobby floor, her heart had leapt before her head, could catch up. She didn't think about rules. She didn't think about her supervisor. She just knelt down and whispered, "You're safe." And that was who she was. The maid who never complained, who never demanded recognition, who never asked for thanks. She worked in shadows, yet somehow left a light behind. Adrian had watched her now, outside the lobby, calm but resolute. He realized he had underestimated her. Not her skill. Anyone could learn to follow procedure. But her courage, her heart, her willingness to act when it mattered, even when the world told her not to. Grace looked up at him, uncertain. She had done what she felt was right. And yet, she expected a reprimand, perhaps even a dismissal. The thought made her stomach tighten. Instead, Adrian smiled, soft and quiet. "You don't work for them anymore," he said. "You work for me now." Her eyes widened. She had never been offered a place at someone's side like that before. Not for her talent, not for her intelligence, but for her integrity. Grace exhaled slowly, letting herself believe it, letting herself hope. Emma's small hand squeezed hers, grounding her in a moment that was both terrifying and extraordinary. She had never complained, never demanded, never asked for recognition. And now, for the first time, she realized that sometimes doing the right thing quietly could change everything. The world might not notice. The rules might frown. But one small act of courage, one choice to care when no one was watching, that was enough. And it was enough for Adrian, enough for Emma, enough for Grace herself. The house was silent. Too silent. Walls stretched high. Polished floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. But the air felt heavy, like it had been holding its breath for years. Adrian's mansion was all perfection, all order and all distance. Even the sunlight spilling through the tall windows felt measured, as if it had been scheduled and filtered before entering. Grace stood in the entryway, her small bag slung over her shoulder, and took it all in. She had imagined working for a billionaire, the luxury, the efficiency, the unquestionable power. But this was different, cold, impersonal. Every step she took echoed. She half expected someone to appear behind a corner and tell her she didn't belong. Adrian, usually a figure of quiet authority, met her at the foot of the grand staircase. Today, he wore a simple gray sweater, jeans instead of a tailored suit. The shift in attire made him more approachable, less a CEO, more father, a small but important gesture. "She's in the playroom," he said, nodding toward a door at the far end of the hallway. "She draws when she's unsure." Grace swallowed and nodded, her heart hammering. She had never met a child like Emma before. 7 years old, autistic, world moving too fast for her senses, yet sharp and aware in ways that most adults could never understand. The door creaked as Grace entered. Emma sat cross-legged on the rug, scribbling furiously with colored pencils. Her little fox stuffed toy rested beside her, slightly worn from constant companionship. Emma didn't look up. She didn't even acknowledge the new presence. Grace set her bag down quietly and knelt a few feet away. She pulled out a pencil and a small notebook from her bag, careful not to make sudden movements. She began sketching. A tree, a sun, a little girl, not trying to force attention, just offering her presence. Emma's pencil paused mid-stroke. Her wide eyes flicked toward Grace, then away again. She didn't speak. She didn't move closer, but she noticed. That was enough for now. Adrian lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, silent. He watched Grace with a mix of hope and caution. This was a child who had retreated into silence after loss, who had been let down by experts and programs, and who had built her own little fortress around herself. Grace, sensing his gaze, didn't look up. She focused on her sketching, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a soft whisper. "Hi, Emma. I'm Grace." The words were simple. No demand, no expectation, just a greeting. Emma's eyes returned to her drawing, then to Grace's hand. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she adjusted her pencil, drawing a small swirl beside the fox. Grace mirrored the movement in her own sketchbook, creating a silent rhythm between them. Minutes stretched into a quiet communion. No words, no pressure, just presence. Grace understood something Adrian never could teach. Emma responded to trust, patience, and quiet consistency, not instruction. When Adrian finally stepped inside, he stayed near the door, giving space, watching, learning. By the end of the first day, Emma hadn't spoken. She hadn't smiled, but she had allowed Grace to sit beside her, to share the space, to mirror her movements. It was a small victory, fragile as glass, but it was a start. And Grace knew that beginnings were rarely loud. Sometimes they were silent, measured, and patient, just like this cold house slowly beginning to feel a little warmer. Days passed, and the mansion remained quiet. But Grace and Emma began to speak in a language no one else could understand. It was slow, subtle, built on gestures, drawings, and the soft rhythms of presence. Words were secondary here. What mattered was trust, consistency, and the gentle acknowledgement that Emma was seen. Grace would kneel beside her at the low table, offering colored pencils, sketchbooks, or even a tiny stack of paint chips. She never rushed. She never demanded. When Emma's hand trembled or her breathing quickened, Grace mirrored her movements, guiding her into a slow, steady rhythm. Hands in, hands out. Breathe in, breathe out. Emma's small fingers eventually followed, a quiet dance they shared without a sound. They developed signs, subtle and private. A gentle tap on the shoulder meant, "I'm here." A tilt of the head meant, "You're safe." A small drawing of a heart meant, "I care." Each movement, each mark on paper, became a word in a language built entirely on connection. Adrian watched in the doorway, arms folded, quiet but ever present. He had tried all the experts, the programs, the structured therapies. All of them failed to reach her. But now, he saw something else. Patience, empathy, and understanding creating bridges where no rules could. One afternoon, Emma held up a small sketch. 3 figures. A tall man, a small girl with fox, and a woman with soft blonde hair. She traced each figure with her tiny fingers. Grace picked up her own notebook and mirrored the drawing, adding small touches, a swirl of pink, a tiny sun. The fox curled beside the little girl. Emma's lips parted slightly. A whisper, not of words, but of recognition. Grace smiled, nodding, her heart full. They had created something rare. Communication that required no expectation, no pressure, only understanding. Adrian stepped closer, careful not to disturb the delicate balance. He knelt beside them. "She's responding to you," he murmured, awe in his voice. Grace shook her head softly. "No, she's choosing to trust. I just followed her pace." The moment stretched, quiet and profound. Adrian realized that he had spent years trying to teach Emma how to speak, how to conform to the world, when all she needed was someone to meet her where she was. Over the weeks, Emma's small gestures grew. A hand pressed gently to Grace's arm meant, "Comfort me." A tiny smile, nearly imperceptible, meant, "I like this." Even when words finally began to emerge, it was through their shared signs, their quiet drawings, their rhythms. Grace understood something Adrian never had to teach. Love, patience, and connection often spoke louder than words. And for Emma, this language without words became her bridge back into the world. In the stillness of the mansion, they built a world of their own. One where trust was spoken before words, and hearts understood before mouths could form sentences. And Adrian, watching silently, realized that sometimes the loudest stories are told not with voices, but with presence, patience, and the courage to be silent together. Adrian Rivers had spent decades building walls. Around himself, around Emma, around everyone he cared about. Rules, schedules, contracts. Each was a brick, each a layer of protection from a world that had taught him grief was dangerous and love was fleeting. But now, those walls were starting to show cracks. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. A soft laugh from Emma while painting. A tiny sigh of contentment as Grace held her hand. A momentary glance that said, "I trust you." Each small gesture chipped away at the barriers Adrian had built so carefully. He noticed it in the mirror one morning. His reflection showed a man whose face no longer bore the armor of constant vigilance. Lines softened. Eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. Dangerous because it dared to challenge everything he thought he knew about control and grief. He caught himself pausing at Emma's doorway more often than necessary, lingering at the top of the stairs while she colored with Grace. He realized he was holding his breath, waiting, hoping, praying that nothing would frighten her, that nothing would undo the fragile trust being built. Adrian's heart was cracking open, and he didn't know if he was ready for it. One evening, he watched from the hallway as Grace guided Emma through a small breathing exercise. "In, out, slow," Grace whispered, moving her hands with gentle precision. Emma mirrored her, trembling at first, then relaxing. The sight stirred something deep inside him, a mixture of awe, fear, and longing. He remembered Lena, his wife, and the void her absence had left. He remembered the nights alone with a crying infant who refused to connect. He remembered the therapists who had tried and failed, the programs that promised results but delivered only frustration. And now, here was Grace, quiet, unassuming, fearless in her care, succeeding where he and countless others had faltered. Adrian's chest tightened. He realized something terrifying. He needed her, not just for Emma, but for himself. Grace was the key to a world he had shut out, the bridge between isolation and connection. But acknowledging that need scared him. Walls had kept him safe for so long. Letting them crumble meant risking vulnerability, heartbreak, and perhaps disappointment. That night, alone in his study, Adrian stared at the city lights, reflecting on the day. Emma had laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years. And Grace had been the reason. He whispered into the darkness, almost himself, "Maybe some walls aren't meant to stay." The cracks were spreading. Fear and hope collided within him. And for the first time in a long time, Adrian Rivers realized that the person who could break his carefully constructed armor wasn't an adversary, but someone who simply cared enough to stay. And deep down, he knew the hardest, most important wall to break was his own, The days had grown quieter at the mansion. Emma was beginning to explore her world with more confidence, her small hands reaching for crayons, her eyes tracing lines across paper, slowly learning that someone could care for her without expectation or judgment. Grace moved quietly by her side, ever patient, offering guidance only when needed, her presence steady and reassuring. But one morning, the calm was interrupted. Amanda, Emma's grandmother, arrived without warning. She stood at the doorway, coat buttoned neatly, hair perfectly styled, her gaze sharp and assessing. "I heard you were here," she said to Adrian, her voice cool and measured. "I want to see my granddaughter." Adrian rose immediately, stepping between Amanda and the girl. "She's your granddaughter," he said calmly, "but right now, she needs someone she trusts. Please wait here." Amanda's eyes shifted to Grace. There was a flicker of disbelief, then a faintly sharp edge in her tone. "And who is this?" Grace offered a small, polite smile, keeping her voice gentle. "I help care for Emma. I'm here to make sure she feels safe." Amanda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Help? What kind of help can someone like you give a child like her?" Emma stiffened immediately, her little hands clutching her fox tighter. Her breathing grew shallow, her body curling slightly as if she could make herself disappear. Grace crouched down slowly beside her, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't speak loudly, didn't argue. Instead, she placed her hands gently over Emma's small ones, whispering softly, "It's okay, honey. You're safe. We're here." For a moment, the tension was thick enough to touch. Amanda continued, her words measured but cutting. "She needs a real mother, not someone who watches from the sidelines." Emma rocked slightly, overwhelmed, her small frame trembling. Grace remained still, her hands moving in the familiar signs they had practiced for months, humming softly under her breath, the melody low and steady. Slowly, Emma's fingers stopped fluttering. Slowly, she leaned against Grace just enough to feel held. Adrian watched quietly, silently grateful for Grace's patience. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue. He simply let her presence do the talking. The house seemed to breathe around them, the tension palpable but gradually easing as Emma's trust in Grace proved stronger than Amanda's intrusion. Later that evening, the mansion had quieted. Emma was asleep, tucked into her bed, her small fox resting beside her. Adrian and Grace sat together in the kitchen, the weight of the afternoon settling between them. "She wants time with Emma," Adrian said at last, his voice low, careful. "She's family. She has a right to know her granddaughter." Grace nodded, thoughtful. "Yes, she's family, and Emma deserved that connection. But it must happen gently, in a way she can understand. Emma's trust comes first." Adrian exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I don't want her to feel abandoned, but I also can't let anyone make her feel unsafe." Grace reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Then you'll make the choice that keeps her heart whole. And Emma will know we're on her side, no matter what." A few days later, Adrian arranged a carefully supervised visit between Amanda and Emma in the garden. Grace was there, silently supporting Emma, offering reassurance without interference, allowing Emma to set the pace. Amanda tried to approach, trying to coerce attention, offer gifts, and issue instructions, but Emma simply shrank back, curling into her own world. Grace did not scold Amanda, did not intervene harshly. Instead, she stayed calm, steady, patient, guiding Emma's attention only toward comfort and safety. Slowly, Emma allowed Amanda to sit nearby. It was a tentative start. She didn't smile or speak, but she didn't panic. Her small hand stayed near Grace's, and her breathing remained steady. Grace whispered softly in signs. "Safe. I'm here. Always." Emma mirrored the signs with tiny fingers, a quiet acknowledgement that she was choosing her trust. Adrian watched from a short distance, his heart full but heavy. He knew the world often misunderstood Emma's needs, assumed they could be met with force or urgency. But Grace understood. Grace had never asked for praise, never demanded recognition. She had simply been there, patient, gentle, unwavering. By the end of the visit, Amanda had started to see the truth in front of her. Love and trust were not dictated by blood alone. They were earned in quiet moments, in patience, in attentiveness to the smallest signals. And in that garden, Amanda began to realize that Grace was not an obstacle. She was the bridge that allowed Emma to safely meet the rest of her world. The tension did not vanish entirely, but the foundation had shifted. Emma had her safe space. Grace had her integrity intact. And Adrian had a growing understanding. Sometimes protecting someone you love is not about control or authority, but about quiet, steady presence, about knowing when to step forward and when to simply hold space. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the garden, Emma finally allowed herself a small smile, her fingers brushing Grace's. It was not a grand moment, not a loud declaration, but it was enough. Enough to show that understanding, patience, and love could survive even the world's misunderstanding. Grace let out a small, relieved breath, knowing that in the quiet, Emma had chosen her. That choice, silent and unforced, was the most powerful affirmation of all. The mansion had always felt like a museum of precision, every surface polished, every room arranged with clinical perfection. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, color began to return. It wasn't the chandeliers or the fine rugs, not in the carefully curated art on the walls. No, the color returned in the small, tender victories that Grace and Emma shared each day. It started with a single pink crayon. Grace had brought a small kit of colors one morning, quietly sitting on a low table while Emma sat nearby, clutching her fox. At first, the little girl only stared at the crayons, unsure, hesitant, as if afraid to trust that the world could be kind. But Grace didn't rush. She simply began to draw slow, deliberate swirls on a scrap of paper. Emma's pencil twitched. A finger hovered over the pink crayon, and then, very slowly, she pressed it to the paper. The swirl was imperfect, jagged even, but it was hers. It was the first time she had chosen to make a mark beyond the safety of black or gray, and to Grace, it was monumental. Days turned into weeks. The mansion's cold, silent halls began to echo with the soft scratch of pencils and crayons, the muted thud of paintbrushes on paper. Emma experimented with colors she had once refused to name, gentle blues, soft lavenders, the green of leaves. Each hue was a step out of fear, a step toward trust. One afternoon, Grace noticed a change that made her heart tighten and expand all at once. Emma had drawn a picture of herself, holding her fox, standing next to Grace, a little figure with soft blonde hair and a warm smile. The background was filled with colors that flowed into one another like a sunrise, pinks, oranges, and soft yellows blending together. She held it up for Grace, her small hands trembling. Grace knelt, her voice barely a whisper. "This is beautiful. You did this." Emma nodded, shy, almost afraid to smile, but her eyes shone in a way they hadn't in years. That simple drawing, a world created entirely on her terms, marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Adrian, who had observed quietly from the doorway for months, felt the shift deeply. He had built walls around himself to keep grief at bay, to maintain control, to ensure that nothing, no one, could ever hurt him again. But as he watched Emma's laughter bubble up over spilled paints, as he saw the joy that returned to a child who had once flinched from the world, he realized something profound. Color wasn't just about pigments. It was about life, about trust, about letting the impossible in. Grace became the gentle guide for Emma's exploration, showing her that mistakes could be colorful too. One day, Emma knocked over a jar of water, spilling across the table and drenching a painting. Instead of scolding, Grace simply smiled. "It's still beautiful. Let's see what happens." Emma's nervous frown softened, and together they experimented, watching colors blend, bleed, and transform into something unexpectedly wonderful. Slowly, the mansion itself began to change. The walls of the playroom, once pristine and intimidating, were now adorned with Emma's art. Stick figures, swirling suns, foxes in a rainbow of shades, small hands joined together. Each piece a declaration that this space now belonged to joy, to freedom, to the child who had once been too afraid to move. Even the garden, once orderly and stark, was touched by this return of color. Emma insisted on planting flowers, bright marigolds, soft lavenders, and cheerful daisies. Adrian, skeptical at first, watched as she knelt in the soil, her tiny fingers patting seeds into the earth, her laughter ringing through the yard like wind chimes. For the first time, the garden felt alive, just as the mansion had begun to feel alive with laughter, noise, and warmth. And through it all, Grace was there, quietly celebrating each victory. She didn't need accolades, didn't seek recognition. Her reward was Emma's trust, her slow but steady opening to the world, and the way Adrian's stoic eyes softened when he witnessed it. He had offered her a place in his house, but she had given life back to it, life, color, and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Adrian found Emma and Grace sitting together in the playroom. Emma was coloring a new scene. 3 figures holding hands, a fox at their feet, a golden sun overhead. The room glowed with the richness of the drawing, the walls echoing the hues. Emma looked up, her eyes bright. She pointed to the figures and signed carefully, "You me us." Grace nodded, signing back, "Always." Adrian stood at the doorway, silent, watching. For so long, he had measured his life in spreadsheets, schedules, and controlled outcomes. But here, in this moment, he understood that some of the most important victories couldn't be quantified. They were measured in smiles, in trust, in a child's laughter, in the return of color to a world that had once seemed monochrome and silent. And in that mansion, amidst the gentle chaos of crayons, paints, and growing trust, life had returned. Color, warmth, and connection were no longer distant possibilities. They were here, tangible, unshakable, and alive. The walls may have once been cold and silent, but now they held something greater. A family learning to speak without words, to heal without haste, and to live in the vibrant spectrum of trust, love, and hope. Years had passed, but the mansion no longer felt like a house of rules and quiet tension. It had become a home, alive with laughter, warm with trust, and echoing with the soft rhythms of connection. The walls, once cold and precise, now bore the vibrant testimony of a child who had learned to feel safe and a woman who had dared to meet her where she was. Emma, now taller and more confident, moved through the rooms with ease. Her small hands, once trembling at the touch of the world, now reached out freely, guiding other children who came to learn, to play, and to grow. She showed them her colors, her stories, her drawings, each one a language of its own. Grace moved beside her like a quiet guardian, ever patient, ever present. She didn't command or instruct. She guided with a gentle hand, a knowing look, a smile that said, "I see you. You are safe." Her courage, her integrity, had built bridges where walls had once stood. Adrian, once a man of contracts and calculations, had learned the beauty of letting go. He had learned to measure life not by control, but by moments of trust, by laughter shared in sunlit rooms, by small hands holding his daughters. And he had learned that family was not defined by blood alone, but by the people who chose to stay, who chose to love, who chose to understand. One quiet morning, the 3 of them sat on the garden bench, sunlight spilling over the flowers Emma had planted. Emma held a small crayon, poised over a fresh sheet of paper. Grace smiled gently, waiting. Adrian leaned back, his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching. Emma drew 3 figures, tall, small, and in between, holding hands beneath a pink sun. She pointed to each figure and signed carefully, "You me us." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She reached down and held Emma's hand, signing back, "Always." Adrian smiled softly, a rare, unguarded expression that spoke volumes. He leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face, and whispered, "Always home." In that moment, everything felt whole. The mansion was no longer just walls and rooms. It was a sanctuary of trust. The past griefs, the fears, the long nights of silence, they all led to this quiet, enduring peace. Grace and Adrian exchanged a glance, a silent, understanding passing between them. No words were needed. Their hearts knew what words could never fully capture, that love, patience, and quiet bravery had reshaped their world. Emma looked up at both of them, her small voice clear. "Family?" Grace nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace. Adrian wrapped an arm around them both. "Always," he whispered. And for the first time in years, the mansion was not just a house. It was alive. Alive with color, laughter, and the knowledge that some families are chosen, some bonds are earned, And some homes are built not from walls, but from the hearts of those brave enough to care. Outside, the sun warmed the garden. The flowers swayed gently. The air carried the faint scent of earth and growth, and Emma, Grace, and Adrian sat together, hand in hand, safe, loved, and finally, always home. The world outside might still misunderstand, rules might still be rigid, and life might still be unpredictable. But within these walls, there was certainty. Here, they belonged. Here, love had triumphed quietly, fiercely, and forever. And that was enough. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of kindness and courage, don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV for more stories that stay with you and inspire long after you hear them.